is dedicated in memory of my father's Atzal. Really, the yard site is the 18th of Tishrei, the second day of Chol Hamoed. And every time Sukkot comes, it's a dilemma. On one hand, it's Man Simchasenu, it's the time of joy. On the other hand, we see who's not here. My father, who spiritually, certainly, and in many other ways also dominated the scene. So his absence is very apparent. And I remember my father mentioned a medrash. I mentioned it actually in his hesped. He said that Eve, who was suffering so much, and he lost so many relatives, and he saw, he had a dream or a vision, and in the dream or vision, he saw a sukkah, and he saw a sukkah that had 4 walls, and then he saw a sukkah that had 3 walls, and then he saw a sukkah that had 2 walls and part of another wall. And the question is, what was the message of this vision? And the medrash, my father said that the halacha is by a sukkah, teishvu kein taduru. When you sit in the sukkah, in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you have to feel like you're sitting in your house. And then the halacha is that, let's say you don't have 4 walls, 3 walls are enough. And if you don't have 3 walls, even 2 walls and a tefach, whatever it is, the whole discussion is also enough. And the question is, how can we understand these 2 halachas together? On one hand, Teishu kein taduru. Who would live in a house that only had 2.5 walls? So the halacha, my father said, is that we have to almost make believe. We have to act as if all 4 walls are there. And sometimes when someone loses a close relative, let it be a spouse, let it be a child, but you have to a certain degree, they have to remain alive together with you. And that's the idea of the sukkah that had the 4 walls. Originally, we have families of 4 walls. But unfortunately, disaster strikes and close relatives pass away. But we keep going anyway. We keep the family going. And as long as the family keeps going, so in a sense, that person to a certain degree is still alive. And we could perhaps, my father would have mentioned this medrash, he would mention this medrash before Yizkor on Shmini Atzeres. But what I think is, the question arises, okay, Yom Kippur, I mentioned Yom Kippur, we say Yizkor, it's almost a halacha, it's a law. Kapil Amcha Yisrael Achayim Hamesim, when we seek atonement not just for the living, but for those who passed away also. But later generations in the Ashkenazi community, I've mentioned it, they instituted saying Yizkor at the end of each holiday, and the question is why? And the answer is because it is at the holidays when families come together that one notices the empty chair. And when we remember the person, to a certain degree, the chair isn't empty. That's part of the halacha of Simchas Yantif. And Simchas Yantif is to be together, the family together, sometimes guests together, whatever it is, people who were disadvantaged to bring as part of the family also. So when I reach Sukkot, Man Simchasenu, I work on myself to remember my father, to remember what he did, to remember who he was, and also to remember some of the Torah that we learned from him. And that relationship, the relationship that we have with the relatives, and with both my parents, with the relatives who were deceased, who passed away, the relationship itself continues to remain. So I'm going to discuss the question about Shmini Atzeres. And I'll start off by discussing Shmini Atzeres. We know in outside Eretz Yisrael is 2 days, except we call one day Shmini Atzeres, and the second day we call Simchas Torah. In Eretz Yisrael, both are the same. But in reality, Simchas Torah and Shmini Atzeres are really the same holiday. My feeling is, when you take a look at the Simchas Torah is not mentioned in the Gemara altogether. Simchas Torah is, there is a quick reference, there is a reference in the Zohar, but really the original source of Simchas Torah and Halacha is in the Tshuvas Hagonim. And I think that it's only at that period of time that Simchas Torah got the emphasis that it now has, began to get the emphasis. I think there was a reason for it. The custom in Babylonian synagogues, when I say Babylonian synagogues, I don't mean synagogues that were in Babylonia, but those who accepted the customs of Babylonia. Bavel, Iraq. The custom was to finish the Torah in 1 year's time. The custom in Eretz Yisrael was to finish the Torah in 3 years' time. And to a certain degree, there was some type of conflict between the two communities. And the Eretz Yisrael community, it can be seen, did not accept upon themselves the authority of the Babylonian community. And at that time, the Babylonian community, the Gaonim of Bavel, were considered to be the outstanding Torah scholars of time, the outstanding Torah authorities of their era. And there was always pressure. And this, even in the time of the Rambam, which was somewhat later, the Rambam tried to pressure the synagogue in Egypt, in Cairo, that followed the custom of the Palestinian custom, the Israeli custom, of reading the Torah 3 years. He tried to get them to change it over to 1 year. And they wouldn't do it. But his son, Rabbi Ahron, who succeeded the Rambam, he was able to convince the Palestinian synagogue in Cairo to read the Torah over 1 year's period of time. Now, reading V'zos HaBracha, which is the last portion of the Torah, the last section of the Torah, was read by synagogues, at least according to many opinions, was read by synagogues on on Simchas Torah, on the second day of Shmini Atzeres, both in the synagogues that observed, that read the Torah in 3-year period, and those that observed it in 1-year period. But the ones who observed it as a 1-year period, the V'zos HaBracha was the completion of the Torah. It wasn't just a reading for Yontif, for the holiday. Whereas the synagogues that read it in 1-year period, it represented the conclusion of the Torah, because we read it in such a way that we should be, every Shabbos, we read a Sedra, a portion, that when Simchas Torah came, we were up to the last portion. So Simchas Torah, the second day of Shmini Atzeres, was always the conclusion, the completion of the Torah. But in the synagogues, they read it in the 3-year cycle. It was just the reading. It wasn't the completion of the Torah, because they didn't complete the Torah every year. So I think that the Gonim stressed the significance of Simchas Torah in order to try to turn it into a very big holiday, in order to get the shuls that read the Torah over a 3-year period instead of a 1-year period, in order to get them to change their custom. And this way, Simchas Torah would not just be, the V'zos HaBracha wouldn't be just a reading, but it would represent the concluding of the Torah for that year. Now, so the Gemara, we read Kol HaBchor, which is in Parshas Re'eh, which contains mention of almost all the regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos. The one holiday it doesn't mention explicitly is Shmini Atzeres. So we read that portion on Shmini Atzeres. There are references, drashos, that are applied to Shmini Atzeres, but Shmini Atzeres is not mentioned in Kol HaBchor or Aser Ta'aser explicitly at all. So it seems strange that we should read this parsha where there is no reference to Shmini Atzeres. Now, the Achronim discuss a shaila. What happens if a person, let's say on Pesach, reads a reading about Pesach in the Torah, and he skips a pasuk by mistake? Does he have to go back to read that pasuk? Or more than that, maybe if he only recognized it afterwards, he has to go back and read the whole reading again. Or no, he doesn't have to go back. And the Achronim, the poskim, say that it depends. If it's on Pesach and it's a reading and he skips a pasuk about Shavuos, so then he doesn't have to go back. But if it's on Pesach and he skips a pasuk about Pesach, he has to go back. So if we follow that opinion, it's extremely difficult. Why we read Kol HaBchor on Shmini Atzeres when there is no reference to Shmini Atzeres at all in Kol HaBchor. That opinion seems to say that we read it because of that particular holiday. My uncle felt that when we read the Torah on a regel being the holiday of Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, and Shmini Atzeres, of course, So if you skip a pasuk that applies to any of the regalim, you have to go back. Because we read the parsha not just because of the particular holiday, but because it's a regal. It's one of these 3 holidays that the Jewish people would go up to Jerusalem. So according to my uncle, we could somehow understand how we read Kol HaBchor. But according to the opinion of most of the poskim, it's very difficult why Kol HaBchor was chosen to be read. There are side reasons, but nothing that focuses on Shmini Atzeres. And then even regard to V'zos HaBracha, which we read, what does V'zos HaBracha talk about? V'zos HaBracha talks about Moshe blessing the Jewish people before he dies. V'zos HaBracha talks about Moshe going up the mountain and looking at the land of Israel and being told by God that he sees the land. According to the Medrash, God showed him everything that was going to take place in the future in Eretz Yisrael when he looked at the land. But he when he went to, and then it tells about Moshe dying, and it talks about Yeshua taking over from Moshe and the impact that Moshe had throughout for generations on the Jewish people. So the question is, what does all of that have to do with Shmini Atzeres? Shmini Atzeres is the 8th day of Sukkot. So why do we read about Moshe blessing the Jewish people? Why do we read about the death of Moshe in Shmini Atzeres? Moshe died in the 7th day of Adar, not in Shmini Atzeres. So what does V'zos HaBracha have to do? And that question is not my question. The Rishonim already asked it. So there are those that suggest, my uncle in his sefer and others say it, that on the last day, on Shmini Atzeres, the people would go to the king and they would bless the king and the king would bless them. When they came to Jerusalem, when the Jews were in Jerusalem for the holiday, so they would go to the king and they would bless the king and the king would bless them. And Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of a king. So we read V'zos HaBracha because this is the last day of the Sukkot holiday, if you want to say that it's part of the Sukkot holiday. And more than that, it's the last day of any of the regalim, because the holidays begin with Pesach, Shavuos, and then Sukkot is the conclusion. So this is the day, in a sense, we're re-experiencing this meeting with the king, blessing of the king, and receiving a blessing from the king. So that's the reason it's suggested that we read V'zos HaBracha. I have some trouble with that reason, though. Now, and then there is another opinion, a very strange opinion. I don't know if we'll get to answer it, but the opinion of Rav Hai Gaon. Rav Hai Gaon had a different text than the Gemara. And he says that on Shmini Atzeres, they read one of 3 parshios, either in B'chukosai Telechu. The truth of the matter is, he says B'chukosai Telechu, that's the brachas. It's not the klolos, but and I don't know if there's enough psukim in the brachas. Maybe they repeated psukim. So in B'chukosai Telechu, or Ki HaMitzvah Hazos, which is in Nitzavim, that's in the mitzvah of tshuva, or it's about talking about the Torah. And also he mentions Kol B'chor. His opinion was, and this is his text on the Gemara, that there were three, every community had a choice to pick one of these three parshios to read on Shmini Atzeres. So the question is even stronger there. What does B'chukosai Telechu have to do with Shmini Atzeres? It's the brachas, the blessings. It's the blessings that God gives to the Jewish people if they act in the proper way. And also, what does the mitzvah of tshuva or hamitzvah zos, having reference to the whole Torah, why is this specifically have to do with Shmini Atzeres? Now, there is a machlokus between the Taz and the Marshal. The Taz's opinion was rejected so outright that the Mishnah Brura on the bottom writes that the Shita was rejected so much that he isn't even mentioning it. That was the expression. And it seems to be a very difficult Shita, a very difficult opinion. Here's the question. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, for example, and the same question in a roundabout manner could apply outside the land of Israel. But it's much simpler to understand that even though they discuss it outside the land of Israel, it's much easier to understand it from the perspective of someone living in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, you sit in Sukkah 7 days. Shmini Atzeres, you don't sit in Sukkah. Now we know that people could accept Yom Tov early. You daven early, and you could accept the Yom Tov early. Some say Shavuos, you can't accept early. But aside from Shavuos, every holiday, you could accept early. Pesach, you might not be able to start the Seder early, but the holiday can start early. You daven Ma'ariv, you daven the evening prayers, and the holiday for you starts early. Let's say if sunset is at 6 o'clock, so you can start the holiday at 5, or even a little bit before 45, you could start the holiday. And we know we do that with Shabbos during the summer. Most synagogues, they don't wait for sunset to start Shabbos. They start Shabbos early. So the question is, what happens if somebody on the 7th day of Sukkot, an hour before sunset, says, I accept Shmini Atzeres upon myself? Is he not, and now he wants to go eat the Shmini Atzeres meal. So is he allowed to eat the Shmini Atzeres meal? The Marshal says that he's not allowed to eat the Shmini Atzeres meal because on one hand, for him, it's Shmini Atzeres. And Shmini Atzeres in Israel, you don't eat in the sukkah. And on the other hand, the day is still the 7th day of Sukkot. So he should have to eat in the sukkah. So he should wait till nightfall to eat. However, from the Taz it appears, he doesn't say it explicitly, but from the Taz it appears that if a person accepts Shmini Atzeres early, if a person accepts Shmini Atzeres early, he wouldn't be required to eat in Sukkah. And the question is, but it's still the 7th day of Pesach. He's not like, he can't make the sun go down. He didn't make the sun go down. And even in Chutz La'aretz, so the Taz says he can go eat in the sukkah without a bracha. The Shmini Atzeres, we don't make a bracha. So the Taz says it's mutter for him outside the land of Israel to go into the sukkah, act as if it's Shmini Atzeres, and eat in the sukkah without a bracha. So the question is, but it's still the seventh day of Sukkot. How are we to understand it? But the answer is, there is a Targum Yonasan, by Yom HaShmini Atzeres Tiyeh Lachem. So Targum Yonasan says that Atzeres Tiyeh Lachem means that you leave the sukkah. The essence of Shmini Atzeres is that you leave the sukkah and you go to your house. In other words, according to Targum Yonasan, it's not because it's no longer Sukkot that you have to leave the sukkah. It's because it's Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres is a reason to go to the house. So the question is, why? What is the significance? Why is it that way? And I think the reason is that there are three, when we think about Shmini Atzeres, we have to understand, we have to compare what is the relationship between Shmini Atzeres and Sukkot. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, and Shmini Atzeres is the 8th day. From a biblical perspective, Shmini Atzeres, we don't go into Sukkah, and it's even better that we shouldn't go into the Sukkah. So what is the relationship between Shmini Atzeres and Sukkot? And we have to understand, what is the holiday of Shmini Atzeres? What historical phenomena does it commemorate? Now we know what Sukkot commemorates. Sukkot commemorates the Jewish people trekking through the desert. According to some opinions, with the Sukkah is to commemorate the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory, the miraculous clouds that protected the Jewish people in the desert. According to others, it's to re-experience the huts that the Jewish people made when they went through the desert. But in any case, Sukkot commemorates God giving us the ability to go through the desert, to give us sustenance in that trip through the desert, to give us the ability to survive, and perhaps even with some form of comfort in the desert. It seems to me that if Shmini Atzeres comes right after Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres commemorates the Jewish people going into Eretz Yisrael. The mitzvah was given before they went into Eretz Yisrael, but it was based on God's commitment and God's word that the Jewish people will go into the land of Israel. And I think it fits in very well. The sukkah is a diras haroi. It represents the temporary dwelling of the Jew. A sukkah can't be made in a manner that that gives it the impression of being a permanent dwelling. The desert was the temporary dwelling of the Jew. Not only the desert, but all of exile, all of Chutz La'aretz. Whenever a Jew lives outside the land of Israel, from the perspective of the Jewish nation and from the perspective of the Jewish people, he is in his temporary dwelling. And the land of Israel That's his permanent dwelling. And there are times when we're chased out of our permanent dwelling. But it's always our goal, our hope, and our belief that we are going to return as a people and as a nation. And it should be as individuals also. We're going to return to our permanent hope, the land of Israel. And that is what Shmini Atzeres is. Shmini Atzeres, we go from the temporary dwelling to the permanent dwelling, as Targum Yonasan ben Uziel says. And then, along with that, I think that, in a sense, the Shmini Atzeres, because it represents the Jewish people entering the land of Eretz Yisrael. And entering the land of Eretz Yisrael, the leadership of the Jewish people is identified with Yehoshua ben Nun. So Shmini Atzeres commemorates the giving over of leadership, the turning over of leadership of the Jewish people from Moshe Rabbeinu to Yehoshua ben Nun. And then I think there's a third. It's not exactly related to the first two, but Shmini Atzeres is a holiday. Shmini Atzeres is a holiday that we celebrate because it's the last of the Regalim, that we celebrate all the other holidays that we had. I once mentioned in the Shiurim here a very beautiful thought that I heard from Rav Wernick, who was the Mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College. He said, in Aleinu we say, Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, lo says dulo liyotze b'reishis. It's our responsibility to give praise to the master of everything, to give greatness, speak in greatness of the Creator. It seems to be redundant. Who is the master of everything? The Creator is the master of everything. God Almighty is both. So he explained the pasuk in a different sort of way. He explained the verse differently. He says we have to give thanks to God that we can give thanks to God. And perhaps this is the holiday of Shmini Atzeres. The holiday of Shmini Atzeres is celebrating that we have holidays, that we come close to God. The idea of the holidays, certainly of the Regalim, and I think of all the Yom Tovim to a certain degree, but certainly to the Regalim, when the Jew traditionally would go to the temple, was that we are going to God. They set aside for the Jews to go to God. Shabbos was the time God came to the Jews. But Yontif was the time when the Jews went to God. And I think with that we could understand perhaps. So Rav Wernick said, we give thanks to God that we could give thanks to God, and or that we do give thanks to God. And this is what I think the holiday of Shmini Atzeres is, because the holiday represents not only giving thanks to God, but coming close to God. And as God says, give me an extra day. I think the idea is in the extra day, it's in a sense to re-experience all the holidays. It's dedicated to celebrating the celebrations. That's why it's very relevant, the reading of Kol HaBchor, which speaks about explicitly about the significance of all the Regalim, even though it doesn't mention Shmini Atzeres. Now, but with what I said earlier, we could perhaps understand why Rav Hai Gaon said that we should read in B'chukosai Telechu. Because what is B'chukosai Telechu? What are the brachas that we get there? In B'chukosai Telechu v'esmitzrosai tishmaru, if you'll do the commandments and perform them, so I will provide your rains in their time. Now we know that that Shmini Atzeres is when we start to say Mashav Haruach Mored Geshem. This is the beginning of the rain period. A matter of fact, one of the strangest customs that we have, it's Minhag HaNeviim, is on Hoshana Rabbah tomorrow morning. We're going to take the Hoshanas, the Aravos, and we're going to take them and we're going to bang them. Bang them on the floor, bang them on a utensil. And when you bang them, the leaves fall off. And the question is, what is the significance of banging them? I once heard from a rabbi, because the Medrash says that there are 4 types of Jews. And the Jew... So the Jew that it was most difficult to get along with for a religious leader was the one compared to the Aravos. So he says that's why on Hoshana Rabbah they banged the Aravos. But I don't think that's certainly not the pshat. But I think the real reason, and I didn't see anybody to say it, and the truth is, I never heard a good explanation for why. It's Minhag HaNeviim, it's a custom of the prophets. But what's the idea behind it? But the Aravos, they grow by the brook. They're called Arvei Nachal. They grow by the stream of waters in the brook next to it. And we are looking forward to the changing season. And where do you notice the rains? In the brooks, in the bodies of water. That's where you notice the effect of the rains. And the falling off of the leaves that are near the brooks shows that we're entering the rainy season. And when we take the Aravos and we bang them on the floor, and the leaves fall off. In a sense, we're expressing our hope, we're expressing our prayer, and perhaps even expressing our belief that the rainy season is about to come. This is the day before Shmini Atzeres, before we say Mashav Haruach U'Mored Geshem. The question is, what's the reason behind all of this? Why do we have to do that? Why isn't it enough? Why isn't it enough to just pray, to say Mashav Haruach, and then later on say the same Baal Mother? If you live in Eretz Yisrael. So what's the purpose of doing all this? Now, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, the Nefesh HaChaim, and this is part of the mystical tradition. There's a belief that the way we act, it says on top of the Kisei, on top of the throne of glory, is Kamar Adam, is like the appearance of man. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner says that God, in creating man, gave man the power to control the world. Somehow his deeds down here on earth affect the heavens. This is all from the mystical tradition. And the heavens then control down here in this world. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner says, therefore, it is our responsibility to a large degree what takes place on earth. We have to understand the power that we have. And we have to use it properly and wisely. In other words, to a certain degree, according to the mystical tradition, when we observe the mitzvos, that affects nature. So perhaps the lesson of the banging of the aravos is that the rain coming, that's nature. In its season, bi'itam, to a certain degree is dependent upon the way we act. And that's bechukosai. Im bechukosai telechu. If you will go follow my decrees and observe my commandments, evasisimosom, and do them, v'nasati geshmechem beitam, I will give you your rain in the proper time. V'nasna haretz yevula, and the land. What land are we talking about? We're talking about Eretz Yisrael. V'nasna haretz yevula v'eitz asada yitem peria, and the trees will give their fruits. So, in a sense, this is talking about Eretz Yisrael, by the land of Israel. This parsha is talking about the rain season. It's very appropriate for Shmini Atzeres. It's very appropriate for Shmini Atzeres. And then, to a certain degree, the mitzvah of tshuva. We'll come back to that, okay? Now, there is a dispute in the Gemara. There is a dispute in the Gemara in Menachos and in Bava Basra, and there's some references in the Rishonim, in Megillah to it, about the last 8 psukim in the Torah, the last 8 verses in the Torah. The last 8 verses in the Torah speaks about the death of Moshe. Vayomas Moshe died. And the Gemara asks a question. There are 2 texts. One reading is, could Moshe, when he's dead, write Vayomas Moshe died? And the other text reads, would Moshe, when he's alive, write that Moshe died? Because it's not true. He didn't die yet. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yeshua says that actually the last 8 verses were written by Yehoshua, Moshe's successor. The last 8 verses of the Torah, from Vayomas Moshe. Some say it applies to the whole parak, and Reb Shimon says no. He says the last 8 verses were written up till the last 8 verses. It was written by Moshe. And God spoke to Moshe, and Moshe repeated it. And Moshe wrote it down. The last 8 verses, Moshe was crying when he wrote it down. So the question is, what's the significance of the fact that he was crying? So there is a dispute. What does it mean he was crying when he wrote it down? Some say that what it means is that some say what it means is that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he wrote it down, so he, instead of using ink, it's a miraculous thing, of course, and it's a very difficult explanation. But instead of using ink, he used tears to write those last 8 words, those last 8 verses. Obviously, later on, I guess Yehoshua filled it up with ink, whatever it is. But originally, it was written with tears. And the question is, what does that mean? And what was the purpose of that, to write it with tears? But the answer is that I mentioned, my father always says, my father said, when you take a look at the Torah and you see the Shira portions of the Torah, the songs, let's say when the sea split and the Jews sang a song. So there is a lot of empty space between the words. It's written in such a way that there should be more empty space than written words. Why is that? My father says, because when it comes to a tune, the message is not limited to the words. The emotions, when it comes to a song, the emotions and feelings expressed by the tune is a major part of the message. And the empty spaces in the Torah represent that part of the message. The message that can't even be put into words. There are feelings and emotions that cannot be expressed. And to a large degree, we could say that this is true about, in other words, the Torah, about the whole Torah. Kisvu lachem es hashira hazos, the mitzvah of writing the Torah, write this song. Most Rishonim say Shira has reference to Hazinu, but you have to write the whole Torah that has Hazinu in it. But the Ralbag says, Kisvu lachem es hashira hazos, the whole Torah is called a Shira. The whole Torah is called a song. Not just because of the Tamei HaMikra. I think because the Torah has emotions and feelings. And in a sense, we have to become one with the Torah. We have to become one with the Torah. My father once said that there's a Hasidic custom. There's a Hasidic custom to do the hakafos, to dance in the night of Shmini Atzeres, not in the day of Shmini Atzeres. And on Simchas Torah, we dance both night and day. And my father said, what is the purpose? My father was a Misnagid, but for some reason, he liked this custom. My father was not musically inclined, even though we're Levium. And certainly wasn't dancing, was not his thing. But to him, it was very important. He would sometimes walk to a shul that was far away from his house because he felt that it was important. I do not suggest that people necessarily do it this year because in the dancing, people are going to come too close to each other. It might be dangerous. But my father felt that it was very important. Why? He said, it's not that Shmini Atzeres is Simchas Torah because we finished the Torah on Shmini Atzeres. He says the day of Shmini Atzeres is dedicated to the special relationship that the Jewish people have with God. And Kutshabrichu V'Oraisa Yisrael Chadu. And the mitzvah of Simcha and Shmini Atzeres, of being joyful, is being happy with God. And it's interesting, Reb Chaim, I saw brought down, I did not hear this from my father. Reb Chaim said, why is it called Simchas Torah? It should be Simchas Yisrael. We're happy with the Torah. So Reb Chaim said, it's not just important that we be happy with the Torah. it's important that the Torah be happy with us also. So Shmini Atzeres is a day dedicated to our relationship with God through the Torah. The Torah is what makes us one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah is not just something, it's not something extraneous to us. It's not just a friend or an acquaintance. Torah tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilas Yaakov. It's an inheritance. But they said, Al Tikra Morasha Al Murasa. It's our bride. It's our intended, the Torah is our intended spouse. Husband and wife are one. The Torah and a person has to be one. The Torah can't just be extraneous to us. So the Torah, we have in it, and so Moshe Rabbeinu's feelings and emotions are part of the Torah. And if he cried when he says, Vayomas Moshe, the Torah has those feelings. It shared the feelings of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because of that, according to some, miraculously, when he wrote about his death, he wrote it with the tears, that the tears should become part of the Torah, at least figuratively. But, on the other hand, the Torah, the other Rishonim say, most Rishonim say, it means he cried when he wrote the Torah. So, but because of that, those last 8 Psukim have special status. They have special status. And because of that, according to some Rishonim, I'm not going to go into all the opinions now, although that was my original intention. Only a special person in the community. In the old days, it was the Talmud Chacham, the person who was the learned scholar. He would get the aliyah of the last 8 psukim. And the question is, why? Certainly, according to the opinion, Joshua wrote it. So why should we honor the scholar, the outstanding individual of the community, with that aliyah, with going up to read those 4 psukim that were not, those 8 psukim, 8 verses that were not written by Moshe? The answer is because those 8 psukim speak of the continuation of Torah even after Moshe died. In fact, I don't want to get into it, but my grandfather explained the Rambam that according to Reb Shimon, Moshe wrote the last 8 psukim, but it didn't have Dushas HaTorah. It did not have the sanctity of the Torah until Moshe actually died. Because that's the nature of Torah. The Torah has to be truth. And of course, it was true that it would happen, but it was written that it did happen, so it only became Torah after Moshe died. With that, that's how my grandfather learned the explanation of the Rambam. In other words, the Rambam says, why would Moshe write Vayomas Moshe? It wouldn't be Torah. And the answer is, it became Torah afterwards when it became true. And Moshe was crying because of because he was focusing about what happens after he passed away. But It became Torah afterwards. That shows that Torah continued even after Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. It represents the continuation of Torah. And it's the Torah scholars in the community who represent Torah. And you see, when Moshe Rabbeinu gave Dushas Torah, wrote the Torah, he said it in front of the Jewish people. This became Torah by itself. There wasn't there wasn't anybody there. It just came Torah automatically. Because of that, the Rambam's opinion is the last 8 psukim, you don't even need a minyan for it. Now, but just go back, I failed to mention one thing. My father's explanation about Shmini Atzeres, he says at night, we don't finish the Torah at night. So why do we dance? We dance because the day is dedicated to the relationship that God has with the Jewish people through the Torah. That's the nature of Shmini Atzeres. And so that's mentioned. In the day, we dance because we finish the Torah in the day. So Shmini Atzeres, the Hasidic minhag was to dance at night because they didn't finish the Torah and Shmini Atzeres itself outside the land of Israel. So only at night. That's because the day itself was dedicated to the relationship we Jews have with God through the Torah. But in the day, they only did it on Simchas Torah, because only on Simchas Torah do we finish the Torah. I just want to add one other thought, and perhaps this fits well with what my father said. We have Shavuos. Shavuos is when God gave the Jewish people the Torah. Yom Kippur, we re-accepted or accepted the Torah. The first acceptance, we made a golden calf afterwards. It's sort of, to a certain degree, nullified. So Yom Kippur is the celebration of the of re-accepting or accepting the Torah. What is Simchas Torah? What is Shmini Atzeres? Shmini Atzeres is celebrating having the Torah. And to a certain degree, it's like a marriage relationship. We make big parties for weddings. We celebrate, everybody's happy. And then, if the problem arises and there's a separation, and then people make up. Very often I remember once it happened, not that I understand this rationally, but the people and their friends, the couple and their friends had a costume party to celebrate their getting back together again. So they make a party also. But the most important thing is not the celebration of the wedding or the engagement or the getting back together again. The most important thing is the relationship of the marriage during the marriage. That's the most important thing. Now, so Torah Tzivulanu Moshe Marashi Kilas Yaakov. We have to, in a sense, complete the marriage. To Marasha is a legal marriage, but the chuppah represents the idea of living together, being married to the Torah. So, and Shmini Atzeres is a day dedicated to Torah, according to my father. And according to my explanation, it's dedicated to the idea of Mesorah. And V'zos HaBracha is dedicated to Mesorah, the giving over, the perpetuation of Torah. The Torah continues even after Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's why we read V'zos HaBracha on Shmini Atzeres, because Shmini Atzeres is dedicated to the idea of the Jews going to Eretz Yisrael. It's dedicated to the leadership changing from Moshe to Yoshua, a different generation of leadership. So too, the Torah, but the Torah continues. And I'll say just a few words here about my father. Of course, you know, he passed away, a certain rabbi who was recognized as a scholar in Israel, and not very traditional in his thoughts. And he published a book. And he actually talks very respectfully about my uncle and respectfully about my father. But the book is against them. You can talk against somebody in a very respectful manner. There is great reverence, you see. And he writes about my father. He writes about my father that my father was, it bothered him. You see, he was really troubled by the fact that my father had felt that the Torah always explained the halacha in a way that was more positive about women than many other people explain it. And he attacks my father for that because he wanted my father to say that the halacha is wrong. Of course, my father would never say such a thing. But he explained my father. He said he remembers my father from many years ago. This fellow at one time learned in Chaim Berlin, although he doesn't mention that. He wasn't in my father's class. And he learned in Lakewood, and he learned in Yeshiva University, and then he went to a bunch of other places also. So he says about my father that my father had to have that approach because of the love he had for the Torah and the love he had for his wife. And he didn't want to choose between the two loves. And my father said what he really believed, but he was a man who had love of Torah. He didn't make parties. It was the love of having the Torah. He and the Torah were one. And he had his true joy. It wasn't the joy making a party. It was the internal joy, the happiness. There is joy that's very often ends in frivolity, but there was true joy with the Torah, and the Torah had true joy with my father. And that's something that's rare today. You have the artificial happiness, the happiness of parties, the frivolity, which ends up sometimes not being nice things. But my father had the true joy of Torah, and the Torah had true joy with him. Okay, we'll leave it here.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.
Yeah, okay.
Didn't your father actually say that idea at his mother's
What?
Levaya about Eov?
He mentioned it there also. He mentioned a number of times. He mentioned also at he mentioned it quite a number of times by Yisker.
Mm-hmm.
He did mention it there also. Yes, he says I'm not allowed to receive nechama until after the burial, but I'm allowed to give myself nechama. That's what he said, and that was the nechama that he.
Soon as when will the share be on YouTube? Hopefully within the next 15 minutes. Hopefully.
What's it? Oh,
When will the share be on?
yeah.
How does one deal with the Yom Tov transition to regular days if we are so joyous? I guess it's Simchas Torah, and then go back to mundane life.
Well, that on the contrary, that is what the idea is. Sukkot, we instill spirituality in the mundane life. There's no being in the sukkah. We don't do ritual in the sukkah. We spiritualize the mundane life. So it should give us a different attitude towards the mundane life.
Or in other words, we have to bring the happiness with us after
That's
Yom Tov.
right. That's correct. They have mitzvah lios with simcha tamid, you know.
Mm-hmm. Did you explain the significance of reading Nitzavim?
Okay, so in the Tzavim, it's the mitzvah of tshuva, or the talking about the Torah. Okay, lo reiku mikem. In other words, according to most Rishonim, excuse me, that the according to most Rishonim, let me just get it a second. Mitzvah zos, lo b'shamayim he. In other words, the Torah is not something foreign from you. To a certain way, we could say, in other words, they were in the Midbar, the Jews were more spiritual. We see the Meraglim, according to Likutei Torah, they felt once the Jews go into Eretz Yisrael, there'll be too many challenges. They won't be spiritually inclined. In the Midbar, where they were getting mun, etc., they were more spiritually inclined. So here it tells us that wherever you are, irregardless of the situation, you can become close to the Torah.
So it's almost like the whole idea of Simchas Torah after Sukkot is to remind us we have to take the joy and the messages of Yom Tov with us after Yom Tov.
Yeah, and if it's tshuva, in other words, the idea is tshuva, Yom Kippur, we get kapara, we get atonement. Sukkot, from the Medrash Rabbah, it appears is the celebration of getting atonement. But tshuva is a lifelong process where we have to reinforce the tshuva. So we could suggest that Shmini. So that's why Shmini Atzeres says we're exiting the holiday, and we're leaving the holiday, which is the celebration of getting kapara. We should understand atonement. That tshuva, returning to God, doesn't end with atonement. It begins with atonement, but we have to reinforce our new ways of life. You know, people go to all kinds of, if they have habits of some sort, whether it's eating habits or smoking habits, whatever, they constantly have to go to support groups. So to a certain degree, when we do tshuva, we have to form our own support group. It doesn't necessarily have to be a group, but we have to offer ourselves support to maintain our new style of life.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much. Have a good Shabbos and Chag Sameach. Rabbi, to everyone, thank you very much.
Okay, no, we'll...
Next week will be on Wednesday again. I mean, on Thursday again.
On Thursday again, yeah. On Thursday again. But after that, it'll be on Sunday.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.